My name is Andrew. I am a 38-year-old freelance copy editor and a passionate amateur botanist. 2 years ago, after saving every spare penny from my remote contracts, I finally bought my dream property, a modest, charming cottage on a half-acre lot at the edge of a quiet suburban valley. The house itself is small, but the real treasure is the garden. I spent 18 months transforming my backyard into a biodiverse sanctuary. I planted native wildflowers, established a small organic vegetable patch, built a composting station, and nurtured a series of rare heirloom fruit trees. For me, gardening is not about control. It is about working in harmony with nature. Unfortunately, my neighbor, Richard, believed in absolute, militaristic control. Richard was a 60-year-old retired corporate executive whose entire personality revolved around dominance, real estate speculation, and his backyard. His house was a massive, sterile, ultra-modern concrete villa that towered over my modest cottage. But Richard's crowning achievement, the thing he treated like a sacred temple, was his lawn. It wasn't just a yard. It was a $15,000 high-maintenance, professionally installed creeping bentgrass turf, the exact same grass variety used on championship golf course greens. Richard was obsessed with it. He employed a professional lawn service that visited twice a week, using specialized cylinders, industrial mowers, and chemical companies to keep the grass at a uniform height of exactly 3.2 millimeters. Not a single weed, clover leaf, or rogue blade of native grass was permitted to exist within his perimeter. To Richard, a lawn was a status symbol, a physical manifestation of his superiority over the suburban landscape. And to Richard, I was just a low-class bohemian occupying prime real estate next door. The trouble started during my second spring on the property. Richard's pristine, chemical-soaked bentgrass lawn required constant manicuring, edge trimming, and pruning of the expensive, imported hybrid rose bushes that lined our shared boundary fence. The fence itself was a sturdy, 2-meter-high cedar structure. Under local property bylaws, the fence belonged strictly to my property, though it sat directly on the boundary line. Because Richard refused to pay the municipal waste management fee for organic and green recycling, he decided to create his own informal disposal system. It started on a Saturday afternoon. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying a cup of chamomile tea, when I heard a heavy rustling along the boundary line. A moment later, a massive, wet pile of freshly cut grass clippings, thick clay mud, and pruned rose branches covered in sharp thorns came flying over the top of the wooden fence, landing directly in the middle of my young raspberry bushes. I frowned, stood up, and walked over to the fence. I peered through a small gap in the cedar slats. Richard was standing there, holding an empty plastic collection bin from his high-end lawnmower. "Richard," I called out politely, "excuse me, I think some of your lawn clippings and rose branches just came over the fence. They landed right on my raspberry crop." Richard didn't even look up at first. He slowly wiped his forehead with a premium microfiber towel, turned his gaze toward the fence, and let out a dry, condescending chuckle. "Oh, that." Richard sighed, waving his hand dismissively. "Don't sweat it, Andrew. It's just organic matter. It's natural fertilizer. Your little jungle over there looks like it needs all the help it can get anyway. I'm actually doing you a favor by giving your soil some premium nutrients. Consider it a free donation." "Richard, I appreciate the thought, but those rose clippings have massive thorns, and the thick, wet grass is going to suffocate my berries," I explained, keeping my voice calm and reasonable. "Please use your own green waste bin. I have a very specific ecological balance in my garden, and I don't want external waste dumped over my fence." Richard's smug expression instantly hardened. He took 2 steps toward the fence, glaring through the slats with cold, arrogant eyes. "Listen to me, copy editor," Richard sneered, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding tone. "I spent $15,000 establishing the finest turf in this county. I am not paying the city an extra $50 a month to haul away basic organic clippings just because you're picky about your weeds. The wind blows things over fences. Gravity happens. It's a natural process. If you don't like a few grass clippings on your dirt, then maybe you should pack up and move back to a downtown apartment. Otherwise, clean it up yourself and stop whining." Without waiting for a reply, he spun on his heel and walked back toward his concrete villa, slamming his patio door shut. Over the next 3 weeks, the situation escalated from a minor annoyance to a systematic campaign of property degradation. Every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork, after Richard's mowing service finished their work, a barrage of yard waste would rain over my fence. It wasn't just grass anymore. Richard began throwing rotten, moldy windfall apples from his trees, muddy clay soil from his flowerbed excavations, and even the dry, smelly waste from his golden retriever. My beautiful raspberry patch was completely crushed under the weight of wet, rotting organic debris. The odor of fermenting grass and dog waste began to drift toward my back porch, ruined my peaceful morning editing sessions, and attracted swarms of flies. I tried filing a complaint with the municipal bylaws office, but the local inspector told me that without clear, high-definition video evidence of the act actually occurring, they could not issue a citation. Because of the height of the fence and the dense foliage of my fruit trees, my basic security cameras couldn't capture the exact moment the waste left Richard's hands. When I tried to speak to Richard one last time, proposing a compromise where we split the cost of a professional green waste bin, he laughed in my face. "I told you, Andrew, it's organic," he mockingly smiled, leaning against his polished SUV. "It's natural. Mother Earth loves it. If you can't handle a little nature, that's your problem. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go apply a pre-emergent herbicide to my bentgrass. I can't have any of your cheap, ugly dandelion seeds blowing onto my perfect green." He got in his car and drove away, leaving me standing in the driveway. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the beautiful, delicate ecosystem of my garden, and then looked up at his pristine, artificial, green golf course lawn. Richard believed that because his lawn was expensive, it gave him the right to treat my property like a landfill. He believed that the laws of suburban society didn't apply to him. But as a botanist, I knew something that Richard, with all his money and high-priced lawn services, completely failed to understand. I understood the absolute, unstoppable, aggressive power of nature when it is properly directed. Richard wanted an organic war. He wanted to dump natural forces onto my land and call it a favor. Very well. I was about to return the favor, tenfold. I was going to use the exact organic principles he boasted about to completely dismantle his $15,000 pride and joy, and there wouldn't be a single chemical, wire, or camera in the world that could stop it. As a copy editor, I spend my days correcting errors in structure, syntax, and logic. As a botanist, I do the exact same thing, except my syntax is soil chemistry, and my logic is ecological balance. Richard had introduced a massive structural error into my garden. Now, it was time to edit his. I sat in my dimly lit workshop that evening, surrounded by jars of dried herbs, soil testing kits, and botanical reference manuals. I knew that trying to fight Richard with chemicals, weed killers, or physical vandalism was a fool's errand. It was illegal, easily traceable, and completely contrary to my principles. No, my counteroffensive would be 100% organic, entirely natural, and completely legal. I began by analyzing the specific vulnerability of Richard's $15,000 pride and joy. His lawn was made of creeping bentgrass, Agrostis stolonifera. Bentgrass is the royalty of the turf world, but like all royalty, it is incredibly inbred, fragile, and high maintenance. It requires massive amounts of water, constant chemical feeding, and a highly specific, slightly acidic soil pH. Most importantly, because it is mowed down to a microscopic 3.2 millimeters, it has an incredibly shallow root system. It survives only because Richard's lawn care service constantly sprays selective pre-emergent herbicides to kill off any native competition. To defeat an artificial empire, you don't use weapons. You simply introduce the natural wilderness that the empire is trying so desperately to suppress. I designed a botanical assault team consisting of 4 highly aggressive, deeply resilient native plant species. I chose them not just for their ability to spread, but for their specific biological defense mechanisms against standard lawn care practices. Creeping Charlie, Glaucoma heteracea, this is the ultimate turf killer. It is a shade-tolerant, fast-growing perennial ground ivy that spreads via stolons, creeping horizontal stems that root at every single node. Once Creeping Charlie gets its roots into a lawn, mowing it actually makes it worse, as the spinning blades chop up the stems and scatter them, creating dozens of new plants. White clover, Trifolium repens clover, is a nitrogen-fixing powerhouse. While Richard's grass relied on artificial chemical fertilizers, clover produces its own food. It loves low-mowed lawns, spreads laterally, and produces tiny, resilient white flowers that attract beneficial pollinators and thousands of bees directly onto the walking surface. Broadleaf plantain, Planago major. This plant has a massive, thick, fibrous taproot that drills deep into the earth, anchoring it firmly. It produces broad, flat leaves that lay completely flat against the ground, effectively stealing all the sunlight and suffocating any grass underneath it. It is entirely immune to standard light-duty, selective herbicides. Wild peppermint, Mentha expiprita mint, is an ecological conqueror. It spreads via underground rhizomes that travel laterally beneath the soil surface, completely outcompeting the shallow roots of the bentgrass for moisture and nutrients. On Wednesday morning, I drove to 3 different local agricultural supply centers and organic nurseries, buying several pounds of pure, raw, non-pelletized seeds for these 4 specific species. But simply throwing seeds over the fence wouldn't work. Richard's lawn care team would spot them, or the pre-emergent chemical barrier he had sprayed would prevent them from germinating. I had to bypass his chemical defenses using pure biological acceleration. I returned to my workshop and dragged out a large, 20-liter food-grade fermentation bucket. I filled it with warm, dechlorinated rainwater. Then, I walked out to my ruined raspberry patch and gathered several handfuls of the wet, rotting grass clippings and dog waste that Richard had thrown over my fence the day before. I dumped his own waste directly into the bucket. To this organic slurry, I added 3 pounds of unrefined brown sugar, 2 cups of organic molasses, and 4 active packets of dry baking yeast. This was not a chemical weapon. It was a highly concentrated biological brewing broth. The yeast and sugars immediately began to feed on the organic waste, kick-starting a rapid fermentation process. Within 12 hours, the liquid was bubbling vigorously, releasing a sweet, yeasty, earthy aroma. This broth was teeming with billions of beneficial, nitrogen-loving soil microbes, active enzymes, and natural growth hormones. Finally, I dumped the entire collection of native seeds, hundreds of thousands of them, directly into the bubbling mixture. I left the seeds to soak in this warm, nutrient-rich bath for exactly 36 hours. In botany, this process is known as liquid priming and scarification. The warm, acidic, fermenting liquid gently softened the tough, protective outer husks of the weed seeds, signaling to their embryos that it was time to wake up. By the end of the process, the seeds were essentially pre-germinated, packed with natural energy, and biologically primed to root and grow within 48 hours of touching any soil, completely bypassing the dormant phase that Richard's pre-emergent herbicides were designed to target. On Friday night, a heavy, thick summer fog rolled into our suburban valley. The air was cool, damp, and perfectly saturated, the absolute ideal environment for seed planting. At midnight, I dressed in dark, quiet clothing. I poured the thick, seed-saturated organic broth into a standard, manual pump garden pressure sprayer. This sprayer didn't have an electric motor. It was entirely silent, relying on manual hand pump pressure. I walked quietly to the edge of my property line, carrying the sprayer and a long, adjustable brass wand extension. I climbed up onto a sturdy wooden stepping stool right next to our shared cedar fence. Looking over the top, I saw Richard's perfectly manicured, glowing green bentgrass lawn, illuminated by his expensive outdoor landscape lighting. It looked like a pristine billiard table. I extended the brass wand over the top of the fence, pointing the nozzle downward at a 45-degree angle toward the edge of his turf. I slowly squeezed the trigger. A fine, completely silent mist of the sugary, yeasty, seed-heavy organic broth began to rain down onto the edge of Richard's lawn. Because the liquid was rich in sugars and organic nutrients, it acted as a natural sticker, binding the pre-primed seeds directly to the soil particles beneath the short blades of grass. I slowly walked the length of the fence, systematically spraying a 2-meter-wide swath of his lawn along our entire boundary line. I didn't damage his property. I didn't break a single law. I was simply returning his natural organic donations back to his soil, enriched with the native flora of our beautiful valley. When the sprayer was empty, I quietly stepped down, thoroughly rinsed my equipment, and went to bed. The trap was set, and the laws of biology were already in motion. For the first 5 days, nothing looked out of the ordinary. Richard's lawn remained a pristine, 3.2-millimeter emerald carpet. On Tuesday, his professional lawn service arrived as scheduled, their high-end cylinder mowers humming rhythmically along the boundary line. I watched from my kitchen window as Richard stood on his porch, sipping an espresso and supervising them with a look of smug satisfaction. He looked over at my fence, likely congratulating himself on having tamed his neighbor. But underneath that fragile, chemically dependent turf, a quiet biological explosion was occurring. Thanks to the liquid priming process, the softened outer husks of my native seed cocktail had split within 48 hours of touching the damp, nutrient-rich soil. While standard wheat seeds would have remained dormant or been choked out by Richard's pre-emergent chemical barriers, my pre-germinated seeds had already anchored their aggressive microroots deep into the earth, fueled by the nitrogen-rich broth made from Richard's own dog waste and grass clippings. By day 7, the weather turned warm and humid, perfect botanical conditions. It started along the wooden fence. A faint, low, purple-green haze began to creep out from the perimeter, spreading laterally toward the center of Richard's lawn. It was the creeping Charlie. When Richard first noticed the tiny, scalloped leaves peeking through his perfect bent grass, he didn't panic. I saw him walk down the steps, bend over, and casually pluck a single stem of the vine with his fingers. He tossed it aside, assuming his automated sprinkler system or his bi-weekly chemical sprays would take care of it. He had no idea that creeping Charlie is a hydrological beast. Every single node on those creeping horizontal stems had already anchored itself. By plucking the top leaf, he had merely triggered a hormonal response in the plant, signaling it to produce more lateral runners. By day 10, the invasion went vertical. The broadleaf plantain exploded into life. Because Richard kept his grass mown so low, the broad, flat, rubbery leaves of the plantain had no vertical competition. They laid completely flat against the soil, acting like tiny solar panels that hogged all the sunlight. Beneath each broad leaf, the fragile, shallow-rooted bentgrass was completely smothered, turning yellow, rotting, and dying within 48 hours from a lack of photosynthesis. On Friday, Richard's lawn service returned. I stood by my apple trees, pretending to prune branches so I could watch the spectacle. The main operator unloaded his massive, specialized cylinder mower, a machine worth thousands of dollars, designed strictly for cutting pristine golf course turf. As he drove the machine along the boundary line, he hit the dense patch of creeping Charlie and broadleaf plantain. Cylinder mowers work on a scissor-like cutting action. They are incredibly precise, but they are completely useless against flat, thick-leaved weeds and tough, fibrous vines. The moment the mower hit the plantain, the blades slipped right over the flat leaves. Even worse, the spinning cylinders caught the creeping stems of the Charlie, chopping them into thousands of tiny, half-inch fragments and violently scattering them across the entire northern half of Richard's yard. In botany, this is the primary method of vegetative propagation. Richard's expensive lawn service had just hand-delivered my botanical invasion to his entire property. By the next morning, Richard's perfect lawn looked like a green and purple patchwork quilt. The white clover had begun to bloom, producing hundreds of tiny, sweet-scented white flowers. Because clover produces its own nitrogen, it looked incredibly vibrant, healthy, and lush, making the chemically starved patches of dying bentgrass around it look incredibly yellow and sickly by comparison. But the real psychological blow came from the wild peppermint. Mint roots travel via underground rhizomes, thick, woody horizontal roots that tunnel deep beneath the soil. While Richard was frantically spraying selective broadleaf herbicides, which the clover and plantain easily resisted due to their thick, waxy leaf coatings, the mint was spreading completely undetected beneath the surface. On Sunday afternoon, Richard walked out onto his lawn to inspect the damage. The sun was hot, and his turf was dry. As his heavy leather shoes stepped onto the grass, he crushed the invisible, creeping mint leaves beneath his feet. Suddenly, a massive, overwhelming wave of sweet, medicinal peppermint fragrance filled the entire suburban air. It didn't smell like a golf course anymore. It smelled like an industrial candy factory. Richard froze. He looked down at his shoes, then looked at the wild, chaotic, buzzing ecosystem that his yard had become. Because of the hundreds of blooming clover flowers, his pristine, sterile lawn was now swarming with thousands of local honeybees, bumblebees, and butterflies. It was a beautiful, thriving native meadow, and Richard's worst nightmare. He let out a guttural, furious scream that echoed off his concrete villa. He ran to his garage, grabbed a manual weed-pulling tool, and began frantically digging into the turf, tearing up giant chunks of dirt in a desperate attempt to stop the invasion. But for every single root of Creeping Charlie he pulled up, 10 chopped-up fragments in the soil were already growing into new plants. The wild had officially reclaimed his empire, and Richard was losing his mind. By the third week, Richard's $15,000 golf course lawn looked like an overgrown, abandoned pasture. The wild peppermint had grown so thick that walking across his yard released a scent so strong it made his eyes water. The clover was a buzzing, white-carpeted minefield of honeybees, making it impossible for him to walk his golden retriever without the dog stepping on a bee and yelping. Creeping Charlie and broadleaf plantain had completely choked out the shallow roots of the delicate creeping bentgrass, leaving patches of black, rotting mud where pristine turf once stood. Richard's lawn care service had officially quit. The supervisor had told him that their specialized, delicate mowers were being destroyed by the tough, fibrous woody stems of the wild mint and plantain, and that the only way to fix his yard now was to completely excavate the soil and start over. But Richard wasn't going to go down without a fight. He wanted vengeance. On a rainy Thursday morning, 2 county sheriff's deputies walked up my driveway and handed me a formal legal summons. Richard was suing me in small claims court for $15,000 in property damage, alleging intentional environmental vandalism, property contamination, and malicious nuisance. He had hired a private, high-priced soil laboratory to take coarse samples of his lawn. The lab had found hundreds of thousands of seeds and root fragments of Glaucoma heteracea, Creeping Charlie, Trifolium repens, white clover, and Mentha expiperita, wild peppermint, along our shared boundary fence. Richard's petition claimed I had intentionally poisoned his land. 3 weeks later, we stood in the local municipal courthouse. Richard was dressed in his sharpest corporate suit, looking confident, flanked by his lawyer. I wore a simple tweed jacket, carrying a single, thick, neatly organized binder. "Your Honor," Richard's lawyer began, pacing confidently in front of the judge's bench. "The evidence is undeniable. My client, a respected member of this community, spent $15,000 installing a professional, championship-grade bentgrass lawn. The defendant, a known amateur botanist with a backyard full of wild weeds, intentionally contaminated my client's property. We have soil reports showing that the highest concentration of these invasive weed species is directly adjacent to the defendant's fence line. This was a targeted, malicious biological attack designed to destroy my client's investment." The judge, a no-nonsense woman with 30 years of municipal law experience, looked over her glasses at me. "Mr. Andrew, how do you plead to these allegations? Did you spray or distribute invasive seeds onto the plaintiff's property?" I stood up, adjusted my glasses, and opened my binder. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "I did not spray, throw, or distribute any foreign, illegal, or toxic substances onto Mr. Richard's property. I merely managed my own soil and boundary line in accordance with local environmental guidelines. If Mr. Richards' lawn suffered an ecological transition, it is entirely the result of his own illegal disposal practices and the natural laws of biology. I pulled out a set of high-resolution, color-printed documents and slid them across to the bailiff to present to the judge. Document number 1, Your Honor, I explained, is a certified municipal property survey. Under Local Bylaw 44A, the 2-meter cedar fence on the boundary line belongs entirely to my property. I am legally responsible for maintaining the soil health, moisture, and structural integrity of the land directly beneath and surrounding my fence. Document number 2, I continued, is a certified list of native, non-regulated plants recommended by the State Department of Agriculture for soil stabilization and pollinator support. White clover, wild peppermint, and creeping ivy are officially classified as native, non-hazardous, beneficial ground covers. They are completely legal to buy, possess, and grow. I planted these native seeds strictly on my side of the fence, in my own soil, to stabilize the ground around my cedar posts. Richard's lawyer jumped up. Your Honor, the defendant is playing word games. The seeds crossed the boundary line. His plants physically invaded my client's multi-thousand-dollar turf. Your Honor, if I may, I interrupted gently. Let's look at why those seeds crossed the fence. Please look at document number 3. I presented a series of time-stamped photos and video stills. Over the past 3 months, I had compiled a detailed log of Richard's yard care team. The photos showed his massive industrial mowers driving directly against my wooden fence, their heavy, spinning blades creating a powerful vacuum that pulled air, soil, and organic debris directly through the gaps in the cedar slats. Mr. Richards' commercial mowers operate with high-velocity lifting decks, I explained. By mowing his grass at an incredibly low 3.2 millimeters directly adjacent to my boundary fence, his own machines created a localized vacuum, pulling my legal, native, beneficial seeds from my soil onto his turf. Furthermore, his mowers chopped up those runners and distributed them across his own yard. I did not step onto his land. I did not throw anything. His own maintenance practices harvested and planted my seeds. But I wasn't finished. I had one final, devastating piece of evidence. And finally, Your Honor, please review document number 4, I said, my voice dropping into a firm, regulatory tone. I handed over a series of high-definition close-up photographs of the organic donations Richard had thrown over my fence over the course of 3 months. The decomposing grass clippings, clay soil, and dog waste. This is a certified report from a local agricultural testing lab, I stated. I took samples of the rotting organic waste that Mr. Richards systematically dumped over my fence onto my raspberry crop. The lab confirmed that the decomposing grass clippings and canine fecal matter contained high levels of active, organic nitrogen and active yeast spores. Mr. Richards' illegal dumping created a highly fertile, moist, nitrogen-rich organic microclimate along my fence line. This illegal fertilizer directly accelerated the germination of my native seeds, allowing them to grow faster and stronger than his fragile, chemically dependent bentgrass could handle. I turned to look directly at Richard, who was slowly turning a deep, furious shade of red. Mr. Richard insisted to me, on multiple occasions, that gravity and wind are natural processes, and that his dumping of organic waste was a free donation to my soil, I concluded. I simply accepted his organic donations, allowed the natural laws of gravity and biology to take their course, and let the wind carry the natural organic consequences back to his own yard. The judge spent 5 minutes reviewing my documentation, comparing my meticulously labeled photos, the municipal bylaws, and the agricultural reports. She slowly lowered the papers, shook her head, and looked at Richard with deep disapproval. This court finds entirely in favor of the defendant, the judge announced, slamming her gavel down with a sharp crack. Mr. Richard, you cannot illegally dump your yard waste over your neighbor's fence, violate municipal disposal bylaws, create an environmental nuisance, and then sue your neighbor when the natural seeds in his soil benefit from your own waste. You chose to maintain a highly fragile, artificial grass variety that is entirely incompatible with a natural suburban ecosystem. The spread of native seeds via wind, gravity, and your own lawnmowers is a natural process. Case dismissed. Not only did the judge throw out the lawsuit, but based on my photographic evidence of his illegal dumping, she fined Richard $1,500 for municipal waste disposal violations and ordered him to pay my court fees. 2 weeks later, the excavators arrived at Richard's property. The proud executive was forced to watch as a team of laborers spent 4 days completely digging up his entire $15,000 backyard, removing 6 inches of topsoil to rid the ground of the deeply anchored wild mint rhizomes and creeping Charlie roots. The entire project cost him upwards of $20,000. Instead of expensive bent grass, Richard was forced to lay down a standard, cheap, durable fescue turf mix that could actually survive a basic weed or two. His yard was no longer a pristine championship golf green. It was just an ordinary, slightly patchy, suburban backyard. As for me, my garden has never been more beautiful. My raspberry bushes, finally free of rotting grass and thorns, produced a record harvest of sweet, juicy fruit. Every evening, I sit on my back porch, sipping a cup of fresh tea brewed with organic wild peppermint harvested right from the edge of my boundary fence. The air is sweet, the bees are buzzing happily in the clover, and my yard is in a state of absolute, peaceful compliance. Thank you so much to our incredible community of green-thumbed rebels for watching today's biological audit. If this story of natural justice, legal compliance, and the unstoppable power of wild mint reminded you that nature always wins, make sure to stomp on that like button like a pesky weed. Drop your own nightmare neighbor stories or gardening victories in the comments below. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and subscribe to the channel. Remember, stay grounded, respect your boundaries, and never underestimate the power of a healthy root system. See you in the next edit.